right, good afternoon, everybody. I am Lawrence Snyder, president of this club. Thank you for joining me for today's celebration of service. And thank you to Joy Harder for welcoming and greeting all of us on our way in. And then also Bob Zaltzberg is going to be our roundabout reporter for the month. So thank you, Bob, for that. Bob, that's 7 months of me saying that. Nobody has ever received that reaction. So, all right, now I want to invite Kyla up for our pledge and reflection. Kyla.
If you'll join me for the pledge.
Pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Thanks. You may be seated. So, as many of you probably know, Rotary has several different focus areas, two of which are education and maternal and child health. You may also know that our club, in cooperation with the other two clubs and several community partners, are planning a maternal and child health event this year. And all of these are very interesting and exciting to me as a mother and also a member of our community wanting to see our children thrive. And one of the reasons I'm able to be here and stand up here today and do the work I do with the university all day long is because I have excellent childcare during the day. So that allows me to participate in Rotary. It also allows me to work full-time. It allows my husband, Trent, to work full-time and contribute to his community as well. As you may know or may not know, this Thursday is Thrive by 5 Day, which is brought to us by our community foundation of Bloomington and Monroe County. And we have several Rotarians who are excited about Thrive by 5 Day, in addition to myself. We have Megan Neese, and of course our friends at the Community Foundation, Glenda Murray, Scott Walters, and our district governor-elect, Jessica Hain. And so I thought it might be good to reflect on the state of early childhood education in Monroe County and think a little bit about what we are dealing with here locally. So I got onto the Monroe County Smart Start site, which is a great site if you want more information about early childhood education. And according to the Indiana Early Learning Advisory Committee, the average cost for high-quality childcare in Monroe County specifically is $9,883 per year. Okay? Just for comparison's sake, tuition and fees for an Indiana resident at Indiana University is $10,680 per year. So you think about how often we talk about saving for college, the importance of saving for college. We do this for the lifetime of the child, in many cases, preparing for this event that we know is going to happen. But many families are faced with a huge financial burden very early in maybe their own careers and very early in the child's life. So it's important that as a community we consider how do we make high quality childhood education accessible. Also for some reference, which I found this statistic frankly shocking, the median salary for preschool teachers in Monroe County is $22,230. Okay. That's about 1,000 under the Indiana average as well. So we know, because Monroe Smart Start shares with us that in the first 5 years of life, a child's brain develops at a faster pace than during any other time. So this is a really critical time for children. Families that have access to affordable early learning programs are able to earn while their children learn. And in Monroe County, more than 4,600 children need care and education during the day. And of those, only 43% are enrolled in high-quality early childhood education programs. So this is something that is an issue that I think all of us in the community can look at and examine, and we need all creativity to address some of these major concerns and challenges. So I thank everyone who contributes to the care and education of children in the early stages of their life, and thanks to Rotary for supporting education and child and maternal health. Thank you.
Thank you, Kyla, and thank you to all Rotarians who are participating, and Megan and the Community Foundation for leading the charge there. Just want to invite Trent up, the other half, to introduce our guests for today. So, Trent.
Hello, Rotarians. It's like Batman and Robin, and I'm Robin, or something. We are very delighted to have some guests with us today, and we welcome them. As I call the guest's name, if you would please stand up and let us welcome you with our applause. We have our first guest, Caleb Jones, a guest of Liz Irwin. We also have with us Megan Gearhart, a guest of Art Omick. And I didn't see any other guests, but just in case, anyone else? All right, good. Well, thank you very much. We would tell our guests that we're very excited that you're with us. We hope to see you again in the future. And if you have any questions about Rotary, please ask someone at your table or someone you're comfortable asking. We'd be delighted to tell you more. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Trent. Megan, great to see you. Megan helped us at RILA this year, so it's great to have her at a luncheon. So, also wanted to make an announcement that if you didn't see in the paper, in the HT this morning, there was a great picture from our centennial celebration and our picture of our hat toss, and I believe it's in the neighbors section of the paper. So check that out if you haven't seen it. Great publicity for all three clubs and the work that Mike and the team did during the centennial year. Birthdays, we have Jack Kirtland on the 5th today, and then Bill Murphy on the 7th, and Feverman on the 9th. So 3 birthdays coming up this week. Membership anniversaries, Aaron Davis and Martha Foster, 6 years. Does that sound right, guys? 6 years. 10. 10 total, okay. Okay, well, congratulations there. And then Jeff McKinn is at 9 years. Continuing on some additional announcements, once again reiterating the It Takes a Village Child and Maternal Health that Kyla referenced. That is on May 18th at the warehouse from 12 to 4. Also want to thank Jean and Joy for putting together our most recent Rotary 505, and I believe there were probably 10 or so people, maybe in 2 separate groups that ended up. Nick's is a big place, so that's okay, but there was some good fellowship taking place. And then I want to invite Sarah Laughlin up for a service opportunity in just a couple of days with the Boys and Girls Club. So Sarah.
So imagine 350 heart-shaped cookies. Sounds pretty good, eh? So the Boys and Girls Club needs help wrapping those, packaging them for their Valentine's Day event. And so we're gonna gather there on February 13th. I think that's a Thursday. From Wednesday. Okay, it's a Wednesday from 11:30 to 1:30, and see if we can't, wrap up these cookies in that amount of time. So we're going to be at the Lincoln Street Boys and Girls Club. They assure me there's parking in their lot. It should be available at that time of the day, or free 2-hour parking on the street nearby. So parking's not an issue. If you're working and you want to come just join us for a little while at lunch, maybe bring a PB&J and eat a quick lunch and then help us pack some cookies. We'd really appreciate it. We'll put it in the roundabout this week, but if you're interested in coming, let me know. 350 cookies to wrap. Thanks.
Depending on how many volunteers, might be 342-ish. Thank you, Sarah. And then also want to invite Mr. Mike Baker up for our 2019-2020 officers. So that's coming. Goodness.
Right, it is. Thank you. I have to say something, Bob. I'm looking forward to the first time you write a letter to the editor. So we have a proposed slate of officers, and if there's any, after I read this slate, if there's any nominations from the floor, we'll take those. And then will be a survey monkey going out probably this week or early next week to vote on this slate. We have, if you're here, please stand. These are the people that have stepped up and said they'd like to serve our club in the following year. Ashley Sullivan, President-elect. Is Ashley here? I didn't see her today. David Meyer. I know Kyla's here. Kyla, thank you. And we have Kyla Treasurer, David Meyer Secretary, forgot to mention that. 2 directors for a 2-year term, and that would be Marilyn Wood, I did see Marilyn, and Alon Barter. Yeah, I'm here. Yep, there you are. Okay, thank you. And the continuing directors for 1 more year will be Ann Connors and Ron Barnes. So thank you all for being willing to serve again. If there's any nominations from the board or from the floor, I'll take them now. Otherwise, look for the Survey Monkey. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mike. It's hard to think. We're thinking multiple years out, but thank you for those of you who are committing to serving that Rotary year. And the current elected or soon-to-be President-elect Aaron Davis and other officers. Looking forward to working with you guys. Also want to make note, you may have seen Natalie on the way in, but she's under the weather, so if you could get time, shoot her a note, wish her well, get to feeling better. So now I want to invite Happy Dollars. Miss Jean, you willing to collect some money for Happy Dollars in Teachers Warehouse?
Bring it on.
Miss Glenda.
$20 because I have 2 things to tell you. One is just a reminder that what Kyla mentioned is that the 4 of us she mentioned are all fundraising for the preschool programs through the Community Foundation. And if you want to talk to any of us afterward, please do so. And secondly, I really want to express my great enthusiasm for the HT and the History Center and Cook, who put together the Community Hall of Fame, the Monroe County History Hall of Fame, and Charlotte Zitlow is one of the 10 people selected this year.
I gave $5 for the 5 people who came to the 505. At least the ones that I knew. Jim and Sally and Phil and Ann and myself. We had a great time. Wish you would have been there.
Well, Jim, I think there was another group that was somewhere else in Nick's.
You were on the first floor,
Yes, we were right there.
and we were on the second floor.
Well, we had it covered. Yeah, good one, Rex.
So what sounded like a bad situation turned into a good situation when my son and daughter-in-law and their 2 children were told that the home they'd been renting was going to be for sale and they had to move out rather quickly. They found an apartment that is 1 block away from where I work. And it's also in the school district that the other grandma works in. So my grandchildren will be going to school where their grandmother works. So cool.
That's great. Yeah, Liz.
To announce that United Way is moving next door, just building north where we are now. So instead of 441 South College, we'll be at 431 South College beginning Friday.
Okay. Mike.
I'm so happy that Martha's back with us.
Yeah. Ron.
How about them Hooters?
Anybody else? All right. Thank you all for sharing. All right, now I want to invite Jim back up, Jim Capshew up, to introduce our speaker for today. Jim.
In 1979, David Paul Nord joined the faculty at Indiana University in the School of Journalism. 40 years later, he's still here, although he did receive an emerita status in 2011. His outstanding career in the history of journalism demonstrated the combined power of IU's well-regarded professional schools built upon the firm foundation of the liberal arts. In fact, when I first met Dave in the 1990s, I thought he was a history professor because he was associate editor of the Journal of American History, housed here on this campus. Well, he was an adjunct member of that faculty. He's also a superb editor, as many would testify. Dave has found time to publish widely. His books and articles are well regarded. His most recent book is close to home, entitled Mapping Lawrence County, Indiana, Annotated Bibliography 1818 to 1941, published last year. In 2012, his peers in the American Journalism Historians Association awarded him the Stanley Cobre Award for Lifetime Achievements in Journalism History. Today, Dave will share his thoughts as well as material examples of the original historic newspapers that span the entire 250-year history of the United States. Please welcome my colleague and friend, Dave Nord.
Thanks, Jim. I first have to apologize because I have a bad cold, and so I'm raspy and drippy and so forth, but I hope that'll at least keep you awake because you'll be so disgusted that you won't be able to drop off to sleep. But here I am, and I hope I can hang in here for a little while. What I'm going to do first is talk to you just briefly, because this is more of a show and tell than it is a lecture. I would like to set up what I want you to see, but then you're going to have to walk around the room to see it. So what I decided to do is bring in a collection of newspapers. I've been collecting newspapers for teaching purposes for decades. Haven't done it for quite a while, but I've got a collection of dozens, scores of newspapers ranging from 1685 to the late 20th century. And so I'm bringing a sample of those to you today. And they're laid out on these tables, chronologically beginning down on that table. These are some papers that I'm going to use to set this up, and then going around chronologically that way. So what I would like to do is, after I finish speaking and we're ready to knock off for the day, you can stay as long as you want, look at the papers, talk to me. I'm going to stay here as long as anybody else is here to answer your questions. And not only the questions about newspapers that you might have, but other questions about publishing, printing, and so forth. As Jim said, and as you can tell, journalism history is one of my main lines. It's not the only thing that I studied. I was also, as an academic, interested in religious publishing. And part of the reason for that is that I would say my field of historical research, I would describe it more as the history of reading and readers than specifically the history of journalism. I've always been interested in how people actually use the things they read and how people read, how they make sense of what they read. And those of us that do that kind of work are fond of saying that reading has a history, that how people read in one place and in one era is not the same as how people read in a different place or era. And to simply look at a text like the text that you see laid out before you here today doesn't tell you everything you need to know about how these objects were used by the people that used them at the time. Some of this is this interest in reading and the history of reading, I think, is prompted by the coming of the digital age, because there are certain aspects of digitization that have dramatically changed the way people read. When I first, in the School of Journalism, I first taught news writing students how to write for the web about 20 years ago. And I had a wonderful little essay by Jacob Nielsen, who was an early web thinker, about how to write for the web. And this little essay, the headline was, "How do users read on the web?" And the lead to his essay was, "They don't." And I thought that captured his point. They skim, they jump around, they never finish anything. They go from one thing to the next. They click on something and go off someplace else. And so when we teach writing for the web, we have to think about reading. How do people read in a different setting? And this is the case throughout history. Reading a Charles Darwin novel in a serialized form in a popular monthly magazine in Victorian England is not the same as reading it in the 20th century in a leather-bound volume, or the same as reading it on an iPad for an English literature class. This is a different reading experience. And there are many things about the reading experience that is different. But one of the differences is physicality and materiality. Those are good jargon words for you here in the university, because you know what I'm talking about. I could give you more jargon, but I'll stick with materiality. That's the theme today. The way in which the packaging shaped how people read. And what I would like you to do is to, as you go through by these newspapers, looking at these newspapers and moving through the centuries, is to think about their use. And so that's the theme for the day. But at the same time, I want you to think about continuity as well as change. And I'll show you what I mean by that. I have to move away from this, so I hope nobody cares that you're not recording me.
We do care because Katz is recording you.
You do? Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, so let's see if I can do this. So let me just set you up for this show. Show you three newspapers that are separated in time by 100 years. A newspaper from the 1740s, a newspaper from the 1840s, and a newspaper from the 1940s. So here's a newspaper from the 1740s. It's the London Gazette. It's from 1745. It's a three-page paper, printed on the front, the inside, and the back is blank, sometimes would be printed. Here's a 1840s newspaper, and it's somewhat the same, except it's big. This is the, whoa, and I've got it upside down. It actually came originally right side out. This is the Louisville Weekly Journal from 1841, and it's a four-page paper as well, printed on a much larger sheet. And then here's 100 years later, a newspaper printed in 1941. The Chicago Tribune, on the day after the attack on Pearl Harbor. Now, those three newspapers are wildly different. They're different in size, they're different typography, different in the case of the Tribune, using some color. But you wouldn't mistake them for anything other than a newspaper. They're obviously newspaper. They're the same medium. You could find more things that are similar about them. The way the titles sound like newspapers. The London Gazette, the Journal, the Tribune. those similarities, I think, are just as important as the differences. But the differences are important when you think about how they were used. So that's what I'd like to have you look as you go through this. One of the things that you might have noticed just with those papers is, and that you can really get a feel for by actually handling these papers, is the difference in the paper itself, the paper that a newspaper is printed on. So let me say a couple things about the technologies that you'll see illustrated by these papers, and starting with paper, newsprint. I'll show you two examples of newsprint from long ago and then from not so long ago. Actually, this is not newsprint. This is a book page. This is a page that was removed from a book that was printed in 1492. So this is an example of paper from the late 15th century. And here's an example of paper from the mid 20th century, totally falling to pieces. So that's a technological thing that you'll notice right away. The older the paper, the better the paper. And of course, it doesn't matter much with newspapers since they're throwaway objects, except for me. I like the old ones, but it doesn't matter to the Chicago Tribune whether anybody still has their newspaper 60 years later. So the way in which paper was manufactured is one of the revolutions that you'll see here. The earliest papers were made by hand-dipped screens, but the first revolution in paper making began in the early 19th century with machines that made paper and allowed for much larger sizes of sheets that could be manufactured easily and quickly. And then later in the late 19th century, paper began to be made with wood pulp, cellulose fiber instead of linen rags, and then the quality of paper deteriorates greatly. And that's why when you go around and look at these, don't worry too much about the 18th century and 19th century papers, but take care of the 20th century ones. They're pretty fragile. So that's part of what changed in this 300-year history that's laid out here, the paper itself. It's both the size as well as the quality of the paper. Now, the size also has something to do with the printing, and I'll say a couple of things about what you'll see here, where you won't really be able to recognize what you're seeing by just seeing the printed page, but there's a revolution in the printing press that happened, several revolutions during this time. The oldest newspaper that I have laid out here at the end of that table is from 1685. It's a London Gazette from 1685. And it's very small, and it was printed on the kind of press that was probably not much different from the press that printed that page from 1492. So 300 years later, and the presses that were printing these objects were similar to the kind of thing that you can picture in your head if you close your eyes and try to imagine what you think an old wooden printing press looks like. You're on the right track. Wood. And the way the presses worked was type was set, and if movable type, here's some movable type that you can have a look at. Movable type was set in a form, flat on a bed, inked paper laid on top of it, and a flat press came down on top of it and pressed the paper into the type. And the machine that did that did it with a screw, perhaps, in the earliest days, or with levers, and not much change through the printing of the 18th century papers that I have here. But a revolution begins to occur in the late 18th century with the switch to iron presses, with same technique of a platen coming down flat on a bed of type, but iron was much easier to put very efficient levering in and speed up the printing process. The first technique change with printing that helped speed up and allow for larger pages to be printed was the cylinder press, which was a printing press where the type was laid flat, same as always, on a bed, and a cylinder was rolled across it to press the paper into the ink type. And that was mainly, it was helpful for speed of printing, but it was also mainly helpful for size. It allowed for larger sheets to be printed, like that Louisville Journal, because with a platen pressing down on the type, it was hard to get a large sheet, get an even press, even compression, where with a roller you can do it evenly across a large bed of type. So that increased the size of these sheets, and you'll see how many of the early 19th century papers, which are usually 4 pages, one sheet printed on both sides, folded once, is the classic early 19th century paper, like the ones like that Louisville Journal. Another revolution came in when instead of setting the type on a flat surface and rolling over it, type was set on a revolving drum. This was called a type revolving press. And so the sheets were run through essentially 2 rollers rolling against each other in opposite directions, like an old wringer washer, one of which had the type mounted on it, and the other did the compression of the type against the paper. And type revolving presses were much faster. And so some of the 19th century newspapers that you'll see here were printing thousands, tens of thousands of copies a day, where the early 18th century papers are a few hundred a week. A New York Tribune or a New York Herald could print by the 1850s 10,000 copies an hour, and on large sheets. And these sheets then could be folded twice and trimmed to make an 8-page paper. And the New York, I'll show you an example of that here. So here's a very well-preserved New York Times from 1864. And it was not trimmed. It missed its trimming to make it into an 8-page paper. So it's a good example to show you how an 8-page paper is printed on one sheet. So there's your standard 8-page paper from the 1850s around 1860. That's a Civil War paper, by the way. You can take a look at that, and I have a few others here too. The problem with type revolving presses, though, is that type was held on to the spinning cylinder by the column rules. The column rules were part of the cylinder. And so newspapers, which might have started adding illustration through woodcuts on a flatbed press, couldn't do that on a type revolving press. And so you don't see many illustrations in these newspapers that are dailies and news weeklies. Illustrations, though, appeared in story papers and weekly papers as well as magazines, and there are examples that I have here. The reason for that is that those were continued to be published on printed on flatbed presses, and they didn't have the need of news to generate pictures so quickly. The way pictures had to be printed on a letterpress, that is where the type is raised and inked, is with woodcuts or some kind of cut where the raised surface is inked. That's the opposite of the way an engraving works or a lithograph. the 19th century was an age of illustration and graphic arts, wonderful graphics and wonderful color lithography, as well as hand-colored engravings. But I'm not telling you anything about that because the newspapers didn't get into that business until later. So here's I give you a little bit of that here. Brother Jonathan is a story paper, and this is an example of one that didn't have the news deadline pressure and so was able to do a lot of illustration because it's filled with stories and pictures. And it's printed, though, on a flatbed press. And here's an example of that. So you can see lots of illustration.
Before Mother Jones.
Yeah, and an effort to do this with news were the weekly magazines in New York, particularly in the 1850s, and then into weekly newspapers, I should say, weekly newspapers, such as Harper's Weekly and Leslie's. And I brought an example of that for you, too, from the Civil War, where there was this eagerness of people to get pictures from the battlefield. And it was hard to do that. Had to work fast, had to have an artist on the scene, send the sketches back by rail to Boston or Philadelphia or New York. Artists working hard over as fast as they could to bring out a weekly newspaper with newsy pictures. And an example of that is this one, Leslie's Illustrated News. So if you're interested in pictures, you can take a look at that. But newspapers, for them to publish pictures involved another revolution in press work, which was to make stereotype plates. The way in which the limitation of mounting type on a rotating cylinder was eliminated by making a mold of an entire sheet of type, a flat mold with paper mache, or something like paper mache, a moist matrix as they call it, pressing that into the type to make a mold that could also make the mold of pictures that were mounted in the bed, and then dried, the paper mache, curved to the shape of a cylinder press, and put into a device to inject type metal into the entire mold of the stereotype plate. And so plating of newspapers in that way after the 1890s became important for having multi-column headlines, for example, which they couldn't have before, and illustrations. So those are some of the kinds of things that you'll see here that are related to technology of paper and of printing and of illustration. But I want you to keep in mind that technology, I think, is a weak cause of these things. I think stronger causes are government and commerce. That by weak, I mean that technological change in media, I think, tends to be called into existence by demand more than pushed into existence by some kind of genius or entrepreneurial work, thinking. Throughout this history, speeding up the movement of information, making things bigger, faster, people looked for ways to do that, and technology was invented for doing that. But when technology comes in, sometimes it surprises us of other things that it might do. But when I mention government and commerce, you'll see that here too, that newspapers always played the same role that they play today, which is to deal with the civic life of communities and the commercial life of communities. So in America, for example, there's an interesting moment of change in the late 18th century when daily newspapers came in. And here's the first daily newspaper. The first daily newspaper in America in the 1780s was the Pennsylvania Packet, and here's a copy from this one is from 1788. And the whole cover of the front page is all advertising. So the function of a daily newspaper was mainly to bring people information about ship landings, ship departures, goods for sale, and so the daily newspaper is the creature of commerce. The weekly newspaper is more the creature of politics and government. And here's an example of the same moment of time of a paper that's more oriented to politics and government is the Gazette of the United States, which is a Federalist newspaper published in Philadelphia and is mainly focused on government. They have advertising too, but the reason for a daily newspaper really came in because of commerce. Newspapers are not really a product, a creature of a free market. They're, from the very beginning in America, the creature of government policy. The government, the federal government, decided that a continental republic needed broad circulation of newspapers, and so newspapers were heavily subsidized throughout the history of the United States in a number of ways, mainly through the mail. The purpose of the post office from the 1790s throughout the 19th century, the main purpose of the post office was to deliver newspapers. They were very cheap to deliver, and they were subsidized by first-class mail that was very expensive. And so the business people who circulated letters through first-class mail were subsidizing the circulation of newspapers. Probably in the early 19th century, 90% of the baggage of news of the post office was newspapers. And part of the circulation of newspapers was free, actually. That editors were free to circulate one copy to every other editor in the country, and the whole purpose of that was to connect the country into a network of citizens. So, and another form of subsidy was government printing. So every county seat had a newspaper because every county seat needed to print the laws, needed to print this, needed to print other government documents. And so newspapers were kind of loss leaders for print shops that mainly subsisted off government printing in the county seat. And there are many, many counties in this country. So we have a system then in the United States that has thousands of newspapers, largely because of the decentralized political system of the country, as well as commerce as well. So there are a few of the papers that I have out for you here are more local papers. I got one from Rensselaer. There's another one here from Bloomington. But then there's others, as you go through this, you'll see others that don't fit the story I'm telling. There's a couple of papers that I have here that are organizational papers. I have a couple religious organizational papers that are published and subsidized by associations. And that, of course, is part of the American tradition as well. The Woman's Journal I have a copy of here, which was an early suffragist paper, and so forth. So you have a lot to look at, and I'm going to look over your shoulder, and you can see what you can see. I'll just end by saying that I see Bob Salzberg back there, and I know he talked to you about the future. The past has sometimes been kind of rocky for newspapers as well, and the whole 20th century, by the way, was a century of consolidation. And the last newspaper on in my display here is the first issue of the merged Herald and Telephone from 1950. And when the Herald and the Telephone merged in 1950, it made Bloomington a one newspaper town. And that was sort of what was going on, that a country that had several newspapers in every city in the early 20th century was getting to the point in the 50s of having maybe just one in a place like Bloomington. New York City in 1900 or 1910 had 50 daily newspapers, but by the 1950s it had just a handful. And now the process continues. So I don't bring you any optimistic news about the future of newspapers, but they have been through a lot in the past.
All right. Thank you, Dave. And he's going to be sticking around with questions and things. I want to make sure to respect everybody's time. But Dave, thank you for being here. And as is our custom, we'll make a contribution to the community kitchen this quarter in your name and speaking here to the club. So thank you. Next week, we have our sheet of a pledge and reflection and greeter that went around. We'll update that and get that taken care of for next week. And our thought for the week, you can be like a thermometer. Weather and temperature was on my mind. You can be like a thermometer, just reflecting the world around you, or you can be a thermostat, one of those people who sets the temperature. I thought that was pretty good. And that ironically came from another presidential candidate, but Cory Booker was who it was credited to. So you can be like a thermometer, just reflecting the world around you, or you can be a thermostat, one of those people who sets the temperature. And I think Rotary does a nice job of that throughout our community and world. So with that, I'll ask you all to rise and join me for the four-way test. Of the things we think, say, or do, first, is it the truth? Second, is it fair to all concerned? Third, with goodwill and better friendships? Fourth, will it be beneficial to all concerned? And fifth, is it fun? Have a great week, everybody.